think that there are several reasons for why anti-Semitism exists. And I think the one that both me and Dr. Laitman are touching on is the greater reason. But I think there are also smaller things that the Jewish people do that causes anti-Semitism to occur. And I think anti-Semitism is almost as a correction. When Jews lose their identity, lose their purpose, forget who they are, there's a sort of rejection to that. And anti-Semitism is basically finding the source of suffering or pain that exists within a society and blaming that on the Jews, whether that be, people looking at, Christianity and saying the Jews killed Jesus, the Black Plague, the pogroms, the economic situation in Germany, and everything, find the source of suffering and blame that on the Jews. But I think if plan B is get off of the path, get hit by anti-Semitism, come back on the path and know who we are, the question to how do we end anti-Semitism is finding what plan A is that we no longer need that to get back on the path. And I think what causes us to get off the path is forgetting who we are and forgetting our purpose. But if we look at things like, for example, dual loyalty, a conversation that I had with my grandmother a few years ago is, I grew up in a very strong, Jewish, proud, ethical, Jewish family. My grandparents on my mother's side were born in Algeria and Morocco. And in 1948, there was a massacre of the Jewish community in Oujda. And they fled Oujda and they fled to France. And she grew up, 20s and up in France, made her living in France with my grandfather. And she really identifies as French. Of course, for her, she's Jewish first, but she really identifies as French. And I asked her, I'm like, Grandma, why do you say that you're French? This is not your nation. This is not your history. This is not your future. This is your experience. And I'm not saying to be against that experience. I'm not saying to be anti-French, respect it, love the culture, but you have to remember who you are. And she's like, no, I'm Jewish, but I'm also French. I was like, okay, let me ask you 3 questions that I think will prove to you that you're not French. If you go to a market and you have an avocado made in France, an avocado produced in Uruguay and one produced in Israel, which one are you going to buy? She said, the one in Israel. And I was like, okay, if there's a war going on and you have to send your son to a war with France or with Israel, which one are you going to send your son to? She said, the one in Israel. I said, okay, if there's tzedakah that you need to give and you could only help one, I know you'd like to help everyone, but in this case, you could only help one. A family in Argentina that's Jewish or a non-Jewish family in Paris, of course, you'd want to help everyone, but you'd help your family first, the same way you'd help your child before a random stranger. We all need to help one another, but there's also a unit that we're a part of. You're part of a family. She said the one that's Jewish in Argentina. I was like, you see, Grandma, in theory, you're saying that you're French, but in practice, you're not. And when everyone hears you saying that you're French, all people that are really French, they see you as a traitor. And so our experience is very much so misunderstood, I think, by the other nations, even in the way that we're.
Yeah, so on that, because that's a big argument. So if all the Jews moved from, Dr. Laitman, if all the Jews moved from their countries where they reside right now, from France,
mentally, not physically, mentally moved to our.
Okay, so
I'm talking about a mental aliyah, not a physical one. Physical, okay. Yes, eventually every Jew should find their way to see their lives being in Israel. But what's important is being mentally in Israel. And there are people physically living in Israel today that are mentally very disconnected from Israel.
True.
So being in Israel is not the answer. Being in Israel, and eventually our goal is to make Israel the entire world, light being around the entire world.
So how do we do it? I want to connect it also to what's happening now. How this, Dr. Laitman, what's happening now in the world, this strange situation we're in, the appearance of this coronavirus, how will that help us reach that Israeli state of mind? Will it help the Jews achieve that? Will it bring the world closer to that realization? How do we? I want to get tachlis. How do we get there? How will this crisis now get us there? Help us get there?
I
truly hope that it will. And if it's not going to be this crisis, it's going to be the crises that will happen later on, because they're already standing by. They're in store for us. So the goal of these crises is to shake the world, and especially shake that group called the people of Israel. It's happening in order to drive humanity towards proper human connection.